Hello and welcome to my second video looking at the era of 1850 to 1854 in American politics. So the last video concentrated on literature, looking at societal interpretation of what was going on at this time and the strife in terms of the sections between the North and the South in that way. In today's video I'm going to concentrate more on the politics and what was going on with the politicians. So we get in 1850 a new president. President Taylor dies, and we've spoken in previous ones when we looked at the 1850 compromise how Taylor almost undid the good work that was being done at that point and could have led to a collapse in that. He's replaced by his vice president, who becomes President Fillmore. Fillmore is a supporter of the compromise. He's been vice president and therefore he has chaired the fierce debates in the Senate, and right from the start of the omnibus bill under Clay, he has been a supporter of it, and he's done his best to try and keep the two warring factions apart and to try and bring a degree of decorum to the Senate, which has been quite difficult in these very trying times. He straight away on becoming president dismissed essentially the whole of the rest of Taylor's cabinet and concentrated on trying to get the compromise passed. He did support the Fugitive Slave Act, and in this he damaged his support with Northern Whigs. He then angered Southern Whigs when he failed to support their filibustering expeditions to Cuba, and so in a way he damages by trying to become neutral and hold the party together. He ends up alienating both sides. He was not selected to stand for the Whigs in '52, and actually went on to join the KnowNothings, which we'll look at later in the video. And the Whig Party essentially from '52 onwards just collapses. So Fillmore is the last of the Whig presidents. We have a very short period of time of him in office, essentially 50 through into '52, and he achieves something of note, I suppose you could say, in terms of getting the 1850 compromise through, but he also doesn't do much to heal the divide within his own party. Now, we then have the 1852 election. The bit at the top is quite my favourite kind of election quote from that election. We polked them in '44, we'll pierce them in '52, and that was the Democrat rallying cry going into the election. Obviously, President Polk, who won in '44, made famous by the Mexican War. So Franklin Pierce is the Democrat who wins the election. He defeats, quite interestingly, his superior in the military, General Winifred Scott. Now we've got Pierce, who is from New Hampshire. We've got Scott, who is from New Jersey. So we've got two Northerners running against each other. However, this doesn't mean that we're about to see a period of great Northern dominance in terms of policy ideas. Pierce's victory looks absolutely crushing if you look at it in terms of the Electoral College, with 254 Electoral College votes against 42. So a gigantic victory. And this is, again, one of the contributing factors to the collapse of the Whigs. It is just the gap of this defeat. In terms of percentages, it's 51% against 44, which isn't quite so dramatic. In terms of raw votes, it's about 1.6 million against 1.3 million. So if you start putting it in those terms, it doesn't appear to be quite the devastating defeat that the Electoral College makes it look like. Possibly more interesting and definitely more closely contested than the election itself were the two nomination processes, and we end up with these two slightly odd nominees because of what happens. It took 49 ballots to elect Pearce at the Democrat convention. Early on, the early leader is Cass, then Buchanan, who would become president in '56 with rather disastrous consequences, is the leader, and then Stephen Douglas looks like he might get the nomination. Stephen Douglas so desperate to become president, and we'll see him later on when we look at the 1860 election, when we look at the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 58 as well. And obviously, Douglas has made a big name for himself, having been responsible for breaking up the 1850 compromise and getting it through. But they all fall by the wayside, and Pearce, this seemingly unremarkable potential candidate, kind of comes through, kind of like a dark horse, appears at the end. The Whig nomination was even more hardly fought. It took 53 ballots for them to decide on their nominee at the Whig convention. There is Fillmore, who's trying to get re-elected, trying to stand again, but the Whigs decide against standing him. He's lost support in both sides of the party. Daniel Webster gave a famous speech in the 1850 compromise from Massachusetts, so it was a darling of kind of New England. But ultimately, it was Scott who, with the kind of the backing of the southern part of the Whig Party, kind of got the vote. The Whigs are horribly divided at this convention between the northern anti-slavery Whigs and the southern pro-slavery Whigs. And really, this is the beginning of the end of the Whigs as a political force. They never recover from this election, and the divides just don't go away. It's almost a precursor to what happens to the Democrats in 1860, as we see the kind of two halves of the party pulling at each other and pulling apart. So this is the end of the Whigs, really. And we then have got Pearce in power. And notice I've got a picture, old cartoon, or part of an old cartoon of Pearce with a bottle of wine or something in his hand. He was notoriously prone to liking a drink. He ultimately died of cirrhosis of the liver. Initially, he was a lawyer from New Hampshire. He served as a brigadier general under Scott, actually, in the Mexican War. And he had served for New Hampshire in both the House and the Senate. So he was an experienced politician. He was really a very outspoken opponent of abolitionism. So although he was a Northerner, he was seen as quite a good compromise candidate because he attacked the extremes in the North, the abolitionists in the North. And is also almost seen, really, during his presidency as a kind of a darling of the South, and part of this kind of slave power conspiracy. So often I found when students have written about Pearce in the past, they tend to mistakenly decide that he was a Southerner just based on the policies that he does. But he isn't a Southerner. He is from the North. Important things he does then in his presidency: the Gadsden Purchase, which was buying some more land from Mexico, and this is mainly to allow the building of a railway across the United States. He's also linked to these failed attempts to gain Cuba and add that to the Union, which was always kind of a real pull for the South, this idea of a kind of a ready-made slave state that could be bolted onto the Union and bolster their position in the Senate and in the House. When the US diplomats, mainly working in European countries, published the Ostend Manifesto, he was very widely criticised and associated with this. He also gets a very bad name for himself in terms of he's the president who signs the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which again we'll look at in future videos. So he was seen as pro-Southern, part of the slave power conspiracy, though he wasn't actually Southern and he was from the North, as I already said. He's a renowned drinker. He had a really kind of tragic family life. Notably, his wife was a very strong opponent of drinking, full stop, let alone in her husband. Tragically, they lost three sons in childhood, the eldest of which died aged 11 in 53 in a tragic train accident where both Pearce and the rest of the family were there as well, and found their son kind of crushed and nearly decapitated. Quite a gruesome story. Other kind of bad luck for Pearce. The one parts that got him through was his VP, a guy called King, who was from Alabama, was a Southerner, and it was part of this joint ticket where with Northerner and Southerner, which had helped Pearce get the nomination. King is really ill right from the time of the convention, actually, and dies very early in his term in office, and he's never actually replaced. And this is probably a bit of a problem for Pearce going forward. Much to Pearce's own shock and horror, he's not reselected to stand in '56, and infamously said that there was nothing left to do but drink. Now, at this time, there were abolitionist politicians or groups, a group of men who later on go on to become abolitionists, which might be more accurate in some cases. And what I've just picked out is some of the kind of the key ones on here. One of the most famous is Seward, whose picture is in the top right-hand corner. And Seward made a really famous speech in 1850 where he talks about there being a higher law than the Constitution. So even if the Constitution accepted slavery, that doesn't mean that he would or that the American people should. So he took a very moral stance against slavery early on in the 50s. His house was actually a stop on the Underground Railroad. Again, not an actual railroad, but a series of safe houses where escaped slaves were sheltered and helped to escape out of America and up into Canada. So he was part of that. He opposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act and was a really, really outspoken opponent of the Dred Scott decision in '57. Goes on eventually to serve, notably under Lincoln, after the 1860 election. Charles Sumner, who is top left of those pictures, is most famous actually for being badly beaten up on the floor of the Senate by a guy called Preston Brooks. Again, we'll look at that in more detail in a later video. He joined the Senate due to support Free Soilers in '51. Was a really strong opponent of the 1850 Compromise. He didn't believe any of the concessions to the South should be given at all. He is particularly outspoken against the fugitive slave law, and then later at Kansas, Nebraska. Simon P. Chase, who is the guy just above me, is a really interesting case, and he really probably is the biggest champion of the anti-slavery cause at this point in time. And ultimately, he leaves the Democrat Party to form the Republican Party. He's one of the early founders of the Republican Party, and one of the key people in kind of setting up their ideology. So again, really setting that kind of abolition thing. But even remember, the Republicans, when they're created, they directly oppose the spreading of slavery, rather than necessarily absolutely calling for abolitionism. The bottom left is Thaddeus Stevens. And again, famous speech in 1850. He says, "This word compromise, when applied to the human rights and constitutional rights, I abhor." So any idea of compromise, he was a huge advocate of civil rights and of ending slavery. And we can see this in his legal career as well as his political one, that he was one of the defense lawyers at the trial of 41 men, 38 of whom were African Americans, who were implicated in a riot in which a slave owner was killed trying to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. So there were abolitionists or people with abolitionist tendencies and pushing a very anti-slavery view in the North, but they are not a majority at this point in time. And some of these guys were seen as pretty extreme. Right. So what's going on in the South? If we've got abolitionists in the North, what have we got in the South? Well, we've got two kind of really key groups in this. We've got the planter class, and then we've got the fire eaters. And some of them, so with some of this, there is a big crossover. So the planter class dominated Southern politics, and therefore slavery and expansion of slavery is always a big issue to Southern politicians. And they might not necessarily be the politicians themselves, so often they were, but they had a lot of control and influence over the politicians. And this is one of the things that led to Northerners to speak about this idea of a slave power conspiracy. How real this is, we're not sure, but these people certainly had a considerable amount of power. Another group you'll often hear spoken about in this era are a group called the Fire Eaters, and they were kind of Southern Democrats who urged the South actually to separate. They called for secession really early on. Their leader had been Calhoun, who died in 1850, but we've got a whole other group of them like Ruffin and Rhett and Wingfool, and again a really important one, this guy William Yancey. And Yancey, we'll see, really comes to the fore not only in the 1850s, but in the 1860 Democrat Convention. So he is one of the people who leads the Southern delegates out. So they're dubbed Fire Eaters by the Northerners, and they are an unabashed, unashamed defenders of slavery and slave rights. The Nashville Convention in 1850, they called for secession, and this group will continually call for secession, and they will spread propaganda against the North, and they will see every little thing done in the North that is anti-slavery as a sign of widespread abolitionism, and they kind of sound the warning bells and whip up a real fervour in the South against Northern politicians. And then this is one of the reasons why we see sectional politics really coming to the fore, and party politics declining. Now, in terms of party politics, the Whigs go, and there's a kind of a gap. Well, there's a period between the Whigs going and the party that we will see come to oppose the Democrats, the Republicans, appearing. And in that gap is a group that I often referred to as the Know-Nothings. And they are nativists, and in this it's a slightly odd use of the word, because they are obviously aren't wanting to protect the rights of Native Americans, but the natives that they're talking about are the early settlers, often referred to as WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and that's what a lot of the early settlers in America had been. They'd come from the United Kingdom, they'd come from Germany, Scandinavia, and so you had this kind of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant kind of mixture, which was the early settlers, and this group had become completely dominant. Now, in terms of their numbers, they were worried because there was mass immigration, and they were really fearful of these immigrants, and they thought these immigrants were bringing different ways of life, particularly different religion. A lot of the new immigrant groups coming over from places like Italy and Poland and parts of Germany were Catholic. And there was also mass Irish immigration as well at this point. And they kind of tapped into a real fear amongst a lot of the Protestant population over this, and they spread a lot of rumour and misinformation, and they blamed a lot of the social ills of the time on the new immigrants. They saw them as the root of crime. They associated them with drunkenness and with corruption. And if you look at the events of things like Tammany Hall in New York, you can see some of the links in here and where some of these ideas came from. Now, they started as these secret societies, and they got the name KnowNothings because when you were part of the secret society, if anybody asked you if you knew anything about a secret society, you would say, "I know nothing." And that's where the name came from. It kind of stuck. They tapped into a lot of the social reform ideas of kind of the Protestant social activists at the time, who were starting to campaign for such things such as prohibition of alcohol, which obviously is something that will re-emerge in America a number of years later. And they also attracted opponents of slavery because of this. They replaced the Whigs as the nation's second largest party, and when in running, they didn't obviously go under the tag of the Know-Nothings. They were largely running under the tag of the American Party, and they grew because they were able to exploit anti-slavery and nativist issues, particularly the nativist ones. And they seemed to be on the verge of carrying the entire country and looking like they were going to become the new dominant political force. And essentially, in a lot of areas, they were just the Whigs rebranded, and this started to become a problem because they they became not only as the know-nothings but also the do-nothings, as they started all this new party came out, all these new ideas, but they didn't really seem to achieve very much. And then as we get into the 50s and immigration for various reasons starts to decline, they kind of started to lose a bit of their key attraction, and we then start to see this unravel with their support of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which then cost them a huge amount of northern support. And they then start to wither and die following this. And we're going to then see from this period onwards, we're going to see the emergence of the Republican Party, but as a northern-only party. So they are an important little bit of American history, and you can see parts of their political ideology running through to the modern day. And it has often been said that President Trump is not really a Republican, but he is more of a know-nothing. And I'll leave you to make what you will of that. Right. Thank you for watching. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you very much. Speak to you again soon.